I found out about my sister's wedding not from a letter, not from a call, not from any trace of the warmth that used to connect us. I found out by accident, through a photograph on social media, where she stood in a white dress against the Tuscan hills, surrounded by comments like, "What a dream," and "the perfect fairy tale." A dream, yes, just not mine. For me, it was a reminder that even family can turn love into a performance, one you can be cut out of without warning. I stood by the window of my apartment in Milan, where I had been living since my divorce, and felt a strange silence rising inside me, the kind that comes after humiliation, when tears no longer make sense. My sister hadn't simply forgotten to invite me. She had chosen not to. My mother explained it in a short message. "It's better if you don't come. You'd only ruin the atmosphere." Those words burned more deeply than any insult. Ruin the atmosphere. As if my very existence were a stain on their perfect, filtered lives. I kept staring at those photos. The smiling guests, the rented castle, the white petals scattered on the ground. Everything looked flawless, as if the world contained no pain, no betrayal, no forgotten sisters. But beneath that polished happiness, I could sense an emptiness. Not just theirs, my own. Because I had allowed them to turn me into a shadow, someone who could be erased without consequence. That night, I didn't sleep. I went through old letters, childhood photos, the two of us holding hands in the garden, laughing as our mother shouted from the window that dinner was getting cold. I tried to find the moment when I stopped belonging. Maybe it was when I chose a different path, not the husband they picked for me, not the quiet suburban life, but independence, solitude, and freedom. To them, it was rebellion. To me, survival. By morning, from the ache of that realization, a plan began to form. Not a vengeful one, not petty, something quieter, deeper. If they believed I wasn't worthy of their celebration, I would create my own. Not a copy, not revenge, a version that was mine. I rented an old villa in Liguria, one I had seen once in a magazine, where the sun poured over terracotta walls and the sea shimmered below like liquid glass. I didn't just want to leave. I wanted to prove to myself that beauty could grow out of pain. That same week, I ordered a simple silk dress, not white, not bridal, but the color of seafoam, soft, almost transparent. It wasn't a symbol of a wedding, but of rebirth. When the photographer asked what I wanted to capture, I said, "Not revenge. The moment a woman takes back her name." At the villa, I arranged a photo shoot. Not for likes, not for attention, but for healing. But the world saw it differently. The images of me standing barefoot on the rocks, wind in my hair, with the caption, "I chose myself," spread across the internet within days. Women from every corner of the world began to write to me, women who had not been invited, who had been forgotten, who had been erased. They saw in my gesture not vanity, but freedom. I hadn't planned for it. I just wanted to stop hurting. But sometimes pain becomes a language the whole world understands, and when it does, everything changes. The villa stood on a cliff above the Ligurian Sea, its walls washed by decades of salt and sun. The shutters creaked when the wind came in from the water, carrying the scent of rosemary and distant firewood. I arrived with one suitcase and a heart that no longer expected anything. Not love, not apology, not closure, just silence. For the first few days, I barely spoke to anyone. The caretaker, an old man named Paolo, brought fresh lemons and bread each morning and left them on the doorstep without a word. The rhythm of his quietness matched mine perfectly. I spent hours wandering the garden, where wildflowers tangled around forgotten statues, and the old fountain whispered like an ancient friend. Every corner of the place seemed to breathe something I had forgotten. peace that wasn't borrowed from anyone else's approval. At night, I would sit on the terrace with a glass of local wine, watching the sun slide into the horizon. The colors were unreal: gold, violet, and crimson melting into each other, as if the sky itself wanted to remind me that endings could be beautiful. Somewhere between the second and third sunset, I realized that the silence no longer hurt. It healed. I began to write again, fragments, half-thoughts, pieces of my own story that had been gathering dust for years. Words like salt on skin, raw, but cleansing. I wrote about the wedding, about the photo I wasn't in, about the message from my mother that had ended everything. But most of all, I wrote about choosing to exist on my own terms. When the photographer arrived, I almost canceled. It felt ridiculous to stage a fairy tale when mine had already been rewritten without me. But something inside whispered, do it anyway. Not for them, for you. We started at dawn. The air was cool, heavy with dew. I wore the seafoam-colored dress, its fabric moving like water against my skin. No jewelry, no veil, no audience. Just the cliffs, the wind, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The photographer, a young woman named Chiara, said quietly, "You look like you're standing inside your own story." For a long moment, I believed her. As she clicked the shutter, I thought about every time I had been told to stay small, quiet, grateful. Every time someone had mistaken my silence for weakness. Every time I had been erased in the name of harmony. And then I smiled. Not for the camera, but for the woman who had survived all of it. When the session ended, Chiara showed me one photo. It was simple. Me standing barefoot on the stone terrace, hair lifted by the wind, eyes closed as if listening to something only I could hear. That was the one I chose. Later that night, I posted it online with a short caption. I wasn't invited to the fairy tale, so I made my own. By morning, the post had thousands of shares. By the end of the week, millions. Messages poured in from women across the world. Teachers, nurses, single mothers, widows. They called it brave, beautiful, defiant. But I didn't feel brave. I just felt seen, maybe for the first time in my life. And yet, as the story spread, so did the ripples, until it reached the very people I had thought I'd left behind. The message came 3 days after the post went viral. It arrived not as a call, not even as a text from my sister, but as a carefully worded email from my mother. The subject line was painfully formal. A few words about recent events. I didn't open it right away. I watched the sea instead, letting the waves roll in and out, steady and indifferent. But curiosity, that old, dangerous instinct, finally won. It began exactly as I expected. We've seen the pictures. Your sister is very upset. This whole thing is becoming embarrassing for the family. Embarrassing. That word again. As if pain could be measured by how it looked from the outside. As if the betrayal of blood mattered less than the opinions of strangers. She wrote that I should take the photos down, that people were misunderstanding my intentions, that I was making it look like my sister had done something cruel. I read those lines again and again, the irony so sharp it almost made me laugh. They hadn't invited me to her wedding. They hadn't spoken to me in over a year. And yet now, because my story had found light, it was suddenly a family matter. Not when I was erased, but when I refused to stay silent about it. I didn't reply. Instead, I closed the laptop and went down to the sea. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day that felt like forgiveness. I walked barefoot into the surf until the hem of my dress was soaked and heavy. There, with the salt stinging my skin, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would never explain my healing to the people who caused the wound. But silence, I soon learned, had its own consequences. By the next morning, a new wave of messages flooded in. Some were from journalists asking for interviews. Others came from women who said my story had given them courage to leave a toxic family, a cold marriage, a small life. And then there were the ones that cut deep, from distant relatives, old classmates, even family friends, each carrying that same undertone of disbelief. Why would you humiliate your sister like this? It was strange to see how easily people took sides when all they knew was a picture and a caption. They turned my grief into entertainment, my solitude into a performance. I had created something honest, and the world had turned it into a spectacle. That night, I sat at the kitchen table of the villa with the lights off, the only glow coming from my phone. The sea murmured below the cliffs, and I scrolled through the endless notifications, hearts, comments, questions. Among them, one message stopped me cold. It was from my sister. Just 2 words. Nice wedding. For a moment, everything inside me went still. No apology, no anger, just cruelty wrapped in sarcasm, as elegant and deliberate as she'd always been. I didn't respond. Instead, I deleted the message and turned off my phone. The next morning, I packed a small bag and drove inland, away from the coast, away from the noise, into the quiet folds of the Italian countryside. I needed to remember who I was before their voices filled every corner of my mind. The road curved through the hills like a ribbon of faded gold. Cypress trees rose in solemn lines, and vineyards rolled endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. The silence was profound, not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that holds you, gently, like the world finally exhaling. I rented a small cottage on the edge of a vineyard outside Siena. It was the kind of place where time slowed down, where mornings smelled of fresh bread and lavender, and evenings belonged to the sound of cicadas. The owner, a widow named Lucia, lived in the house next door. She greeted me with a nod and a soft smile that said she'd seen her share of stories and didn't need to ask for mine. For the first few days, I worked in the vineyard with her. Not because I needed to, but because it gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to heal. We picked grapes under the sun, our fingers stained purple, our shoulders aching. It was honest work, grounding, the kind that forces you to exist entirely in the moment. Sometimes Lucia would hum old Italian songs, half lullaby, half lament, and I'd listen without understanding the words but feeling every note. She never asked about my past. But once, while pouring us glasses of her homemade wine, she said quietly, "You can't control what they take from you, but you can decide what you give back to yourself." That night, I wrote those words in my journal. Give back to yourself. It became a kind of prayer. I stopped checking social media. The noise of the world faded, replaced by the rhythm of the vineyard, the whisper of leaves, the hum of bees, the creak of wooden barrels in the cellar. I began painting again, something I hadn't done since childhood. At first, it was clumsy, uneven strokes and uncertain colors. But slowly, shapes began to form. The villa, the sea, the cliffs where I had stood alone. Except now, I painted myself not as a figure of loss, but of stillness. Weeks passed. The story that had once consumed the internet began to fade into the endless churn of new scandals, new distractions. My name disappeared from headlines. And strangely, that anonymity felt like peace. Then one evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Lucia came to the cottage holding a letter. "From America," she said softly. My hands trembled as I took it. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. I hadn't seen it in years. Inside was a single page, no greeting, no apology, just a few tight sentences written in his familiar, restrained tone. "Your mother is ill. Your sister has returned home. It would mean a great deal if you came back. The past is the past. I stared at the words until they blurred. The past is the past. Such an easy phrase, as if time could wash away what was said, what was done, what was broken. For a long time, I stood at the edge of the vineyard, the letter trembling in my hand. The sun had disappeared, leaving only a pale echo of light. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, slow, deliberate, mournful. I realized then that forgiveness is not the same as return. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the unopened bottle of Lucia's wine beside me, thinking about what waited across the ocean. The same house, the same silences, the same unspoken rules. And yet, something inside me shifted. I no longer felt like the girl who had been left out. I had built something of my own, a life that didn't need their permission to exist. But perhaps, I thought, I didn't need to forgive them to face them. Perhaps I just needed to be seen, one last time, on my own terms. The flight back to the States felt longer than it should have. Every cloud outside the window looked like a thought I had tried to forget. Heavy, shapeless, waiting to rain. I landed in Boston just after dawn. The air felt colder, denser, as if the city itself remembered who I used to be and wasn't sure it wanted me back. The drive to my parents' house was painfully familiar. The same narrow streets, the same manicured lawns, the same house standing at the end of the cul-de-sac with its white shutters and perfect garden. Nothing had changed, except me. When I pulled into the driveway, my father was waiting at the door. His hair had gone completely gray, his shoulders smaller, but his expression was still carefully composed, the look of a man who avoided feelings by organizing them. He didn't hug me. Instead, he said quietly, "She's upstairs. She's been asking for you." The house smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the old wood echoing memories I didn't want. My mother's room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light. She looked frail, but not defeated, still the same woman who had once controlled everything through poise and tone. When she saw me, she didn't smile. Her lips trembled slightly before she spoke. "You look different." "I am," I said simply. For a while we just sat there, the air thick with years of unspoken things. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "Your sister's in the kitchen. She wanted to leave before you arrived, but I asked her to stay." Downstairs, I found my sister by the window, her back turned. She was stirring her coffee as if the motion itself could shield her from the weight of our history. When she turned, her eyes met mine, guarded, searching, and for the first time, uncertain. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I almost didn't." We stood in silence, two strangers bound by blood and distance. Then, unable to stop myself, I asked the question that had haunted me since that email. "Why didn't you invite me?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because you make everything about you." The words hit like a slap, yet there was no anger left in me to give back. I simply looked at her and realized she truly believed it. She had built her world on appearances, on control, on the comfort of being adored. And I had never fit into that illusion. "I made my own story because you erased me from yours," I said quietly. "That's not selfishness, that's survival." She looked away first. "You embarrassed us." "No," I replied, my voice steady. "You embarrassed yourselves. I just stopped pretending it was love." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The distance between us wasn't something that could be bridged by apology. It was structural, built into the foundation of our family long before either of us knew it. Before I left the kitchen, my sister said something I almost missed. "They're saying your post changed people's lives. Maybe that's your thing now, inspiring strangers. I paused in the doorway. Maybe. At least they see me. When I returned to my mother's room, she was watching me with that same calculating stillness. "You've always been dramatic," she murmured. "But I suppose the world needs people like you." I smiled faintly. "It's not drama, Mom. It's truth." And with that, I kissed her forehead. Not as forgiveness, but as farewell. As I walked out of that house, I realized something profound. I had come not to reconcile, but to reclaim. To look them in the eyes and confirm that I no longer needed their acceptance to exist. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply lost its power. Back in Italy, the villa felt different, not like an escape anymore, but like home. The sea was calm that evening, a mirror of silver light stretching endlessly toward the horizon. I stood on the terrace where everything had begun, where I had once posed for a photo out of defiance, out of pain. And now it felt like something entirely new. Closure. The world had moved on, as it always does. The headlines had faded, the comments had quieted, and the noise had turned back into silence. Yet that silence no longer frightened me. It felt earned, chosen. I spent the first days after returning walking through the hills with my camera, capturing small, imperfect moments. A woman hanging laundry in the wind, a child chasing pigeons through a narrow street, an old couple holding hands in the shade. It struck me that these were the real fairy tales, not the weddings, not the polished perfection, but the quiet endurance of ordinary love. Sometimes letters arrived from women who had read my story. They wrote about starting over at 50, about finding strength after betrayal, about taking a solo trip for the first time in decades. One woman sent a photo of herself standing barefoot on a beach with the caption, "I chose myself too." I printed that picture and pinned it above my desk. It was proof that something born of pain could become a bridge to others. Lucia visited often, bringing bread and stories. "You look peaceful now," she said once, pouring wine into 2 mismatched glasses. I smiled. Maybe peace isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's the middle, the part where you finally stop running. We sat in the fading light, watching the last sunbeams slip over the vines. Somewhere, church bells rang again, the same sound that had followed me when I left the vineyard weeks ago. Only now it didn't sound mournful. It sounded like return. That night, I wrote my final entry in the journal I had started the day my sister's wedding photos appeared online. The page remained mostly blank except for one line. "They made me a ghost, but I became a story." I closed the book and set it aside, not to forget but to move forward. The pain that had once defined me was no longer the center of my life. It had become a backdrop, like the sea behind the villa, always there but no longer consuming. The next morning, I took the same dress, the seafoam one that had started everything, and hung it on the terrace railing. The wind caught the fabric and lifted it gently, like a flag of surrender or maybe of freedom. I took one last photograph, not for the world this time, but for myself. Later, as I walked down the path toward the village, I thought about the strange symmetry of it all. I had been uninvited from one fairy tale and ended up creating another, not perfect, not planned, but real. A fairy tale not about romance, but about reclamation. In the end, Italy had given me something no family ever had, permission to exist without apology. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the quiet waves and the scent of wild thyme, I finally understood. Being uninvited was never the tragedy. It was the beginning.